China's flood situation has reached a new high. New waves of flooding are taking shape in China's two biggest rivers. The Three Gorges Dam will face the greatest flow since its construction. Heavy rain has been battering both the north and south. Some villages were even buried up to 3 stories high. Which flag represents true Chinese heritage? The battle between Communist China's red flag and Taiwan's blue sky, white sun, holy red earth flag is making a turn in San Francisco. One of the party's princelings, who is also a retired professor from the Chinese Communist Party school, called the party a common enemy of humankind. She was kicked out of the party, indicating more splitting within its ranks. And Chinese authorities are urging auto companies to recycle old parts for reuse. Our in-house expert says the move signals that China is preparing for a potential decoupling with the West. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. China's flood situation has reached a new high. New waves of flooding are taking shape in the country's two biggest rivers, the Yangtze and Yellow rivers. The Three Gorges Reservoir, located in Hubei province along the Yangtze River, is forecast to see a flood peak of 74,000 cubic meters per second on Thursday. That would mark the greatest flow since the famous dam's construction. The Ming River, the Yangtze River's biggest tributary, is also expected to see historic high flood levels never before seen in the area. In preparation, officials from the southwestern province of Sichuan issued the highest level overflow warning for the area. It's the first time the maximum danger warning has ever been used. Elsewhere in both northern and southern China, heavy rain has been battering the country for weeks. In the northwest, it caused a landslide and flooded the homes of 300 farmers. And still on its way, Typhoon Higis is set to make landfall on Wednesday in China's southern coastal areas. It'll be the third typhoon to hit the country this year, and with it will come even more rain. In Sichuan province on Sunday, the water level rose so rapidly that the two ends of a bridge were quickly flooded, trapping cars along the middle of the bridge. The high water also flooded a supermarket, where video shows instant noodles floated on the surface. Now we take a look at an enormous wave of mudslides in northwest China. Some villages were even buried up to 3 stories high. That's as at least 800 people were trapped.
In the afternoon on Monday, mountain slides hit some areas of Longnan City of northwestern Chinese Gansu province. A mud rock flow burst into a river, forming a lake. Some villages are located within the lake. According to local media, more than 13,000 people in that area were evacuated, but still many couldn't make it in time. Muddy water flooded the houses, and people were standing on the roofs waiting for rescue.
Shuimogo village was completely flooded. The buildings were flooded, covering 3 floors. Everything is shut down. People died. There is nowhere for me to go. Some people are missing. 10 or 20 people have been rescued. 800 people are trapped.
On the morning of Tuesday, villagers told us that the water level of the lake had dropped by over 10 feet, revealing 2 floors that had been flooded, causing huge losses.
All wooden houses collapsed. Water and electricity have been shut down since yesterday. It rains every day. There are landslides and mudslides everywhere in the valleys. The river is blocked. Everywhere is totally flooded. Floodwater released by blasting has been carried out several times, and houses were also damaged. We are so saddened. The loss is great. All the people have been evacuated now. We all felt desperate.
The water of the river was rising to an extremely high level and swept a bridge away. Mud and rock flow from the mountain rushed into the river, causing yellow mud waves. Muddy water washed down a sloping street, pushing several cars downstream, and the person who captured the clip shouted to the passerbys, "Hurry up!" Reporting by Xiong Bin, Li Peiling, NTD News.
But mudslides aren't the only storm to hit Gansu province. Snowfall there turned 2 counties inside the province from summer to winter overnight on Sunday. The heavy snow damaged crops and froze livestock. The unusually timed weather is the 9th instance of snow in recent weeks. According to the Chinese lunar calendar, all 9 have fallen in the month of June. In Chinese culture, snow during the 6th month of the lunar calendar, June, is thought to indicate that great injustice is taking place in the country. Now we shift from ice to fire. On Monday afternoon in Guangdong province, a building in Qingyuan city suddenly burst into flames. The blaze spread rapidly through all 7 floors, quickly transforming the building into a column of flame. It was extinguished after burning for around 2 hours. The building was home to a shopping center and a hotel. A witness confirmed the mall was operating normally when the fire broke out. But Chinese state-run media claimed there were no casualties or people trapped inside. According to the official website of China's northeast city, Shenyang, on Tuesday morning, part of a primary school in the city collapsed, resulting in 2 injuries. According to the video, the building's 2nd and 3rd floors collapsed. A person wearing a blue shirt lying on a stretcher is rushed out by other people wearing blue shirts. In the video, people point out that those wearing blue shirts are school teachers. Some netizens ridiculed it, calling it tofu quality buildings. Poor quality builds are not unusual in China, but unfortunately, even elementary schools have not been spared. But at least it is still summer vacation and students are not in the school. A retired professor from the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP, school was kicked out of the party on Monday. Her pension was also suspended. She was considered a so-called princeling of the party, and her attitude indicates the splitting within its ranks is becoming more and more visible. The party accused her of making speeches with serious political implications and of damaging the country's reputation. The move relates back to an audio recording released back in June. Allegedly made by the professor, the recording was supposedly made during an internal party meeting held to discuss the potential that party leader Xi Jinping would step down. The details on when weren't mentioned. During the gathering, the professor in question, Cai Xia, described the CCP as a political zombie and called Xi a gangster boss. She added the only way out is to remove Xi and correct the wrong direction of the party.
There are 2 major issues that must be discarded from the root. One is our system and the other is our theory.
When the CCP virus whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang died, Xia joined an appeal for freedom of speech. And after Beijing imposed its national security law on Hong Kong, she wrote an article that referred to the party as a common enemy of humankind. Her statements represent a group who criticize the regime, yet hope it can one day be improved. But another group of critics increasingly say that hope is merely an illusion. Well-known Chinese historian Xin Haonian commented on Professor Cai's words, explaining that it's not only a problem with Xi, but that the party itself must be removed. Professor Cai reportedly fled to the U.S. months ago. She responded to the move via social media on Monday, voicing protest over the freezing of her pension. She said she is happy to totally decouple from this gangster-like party. She added that she's coming back to the people and noted every generation has its own responsibilities. We must fight for the political transformation of China and pay the price. According to Wang Dan, a student leader during China's 1989 democracy movement, Cai Xia is one of the party's princelings, part of the so-called second red generation. Her status is due to her grandfather being one of the CCP's earliest members. Her mother, as well as 2 other relatives, also held important positions in the Chinese army. Dan wrote that Xia's rupture with the CCP definitely doesn't only represent her alone. Among her students are a large number of senior officials at the provincial and ministerial levels of the CCP. Therefore, her political actions are extremely symbolic. The second red generation of the party has split. With U.S.-China tensions on the rise, Chinese leader Xi is calling for a more self-reliant economy. Chinese authorities are now making unusual moves to target the auto industry. NTD's Juliet Song reports.
Chinese authorities are urging automakers nationwide to recycle their used parts. Our in-house expert explains when officials say parts, they specifically mean parts from imported cars, something China's auto industry heavily relies on. He said the move signals authorities' concern over a potential decoupling with the West, which could lead to shortages of critical auto parts.
Because they can't produce the parts themselves or produce them with the same quality, they'd rather use old parts from imported cars and reuse them. The quality of old imported parts might even be better than those newly made in China.
He said that's especially true when it comes to the most important vehicle components, namely the engine, transmission, and chassis.
These are the most technically challenging and the most important for a car, or even the entire auto industry.
In 2019, China imported $1.4 billion worth of transmission parts. That's over 40% of that year's total part imports. Tang said China's auto industry is limited in its manufacturing ability, mainly because of the country's political system under the communist regime. In China, large-scale auto companies are state-owned. Some are registered as private companies, but they're often controlled by the regime. On top of that, the heads of these companies are often high-level Communist Party officials.
This brings a problem, which is these company leaders care more about their political careers than the company's future. And oftentimes, these people will be moved to other positions or go back to politics in a few years.
Since the company's profit gains are directly tied to that official's political status, they often opt for short-term gains instead of long-term development. Developing key auto parts can sometimes take more than a decade, but to make a quick buck, many Chinese brands build cars using imported parts and simply attach their own label.
So these companies can make profits in the short term, but they cannot rid themselves of reliance on imported car parts and technology. Because they can't produce it themselves, they can only take from others.
And this presents a huge risk.
Once decoupling really happens, then it's very likely that China would have a very hard time making an advanced and competitive car on its own.
Even if the country could produce its own cars, there may be a huge gap in quality.
The Chinese-made cars could be generations behind, say 1 or 2 generations.
Tang said since those cars aren't competitive on the international market, they can only be sold domestically. This fits the bill for Chinese leader Xi's recent push for a self-reliant economy. Juliet Song, NTD News.
Now to Hong Kong. Hong Kong's leader Carrie Lam says she's having trouble using her credit cards after the U.S. imposed sanctions on her. Lam was one of the 11 officials sanctioned earlier this month by President Trump. The reason? Their roles in supporting Beijing's draconian national security law on Hong Kong. In an interview with Chinese state broadcaster CGTN, she said she knows that she will face inconveniences due to the sanctions. She explained she has some financial services, but doesn't know whether they relate back to agencies involved in American businesses. Turning to another of the city's sanctioned officials, Hong Kong media reported that the city's police commissioner, Chris Tang, had transferred his house from the British bank HSBC to Bank of China, just before U.S. authorities announced the sanctions earlier this month. He's one of the 11 affected by the penalties. Documents from the land registry also show that Tang signed sub-mortgage documents 3 days before the announcement. Tang said in a recent interview that banking services were partially suspended. According to Bloomberg, after the U.S. announced the sanctions list, most banks in Hong Kong have acted in accordance, including banks from mainland China. But no details have emerged about how the Chinese banks are going to operate. HSBC issued a statement saying that it will screen customer transactions based on the sanction list and reject related transactions. In San Francisco, local Chinese communities are taking down the Communist Party's red flags from their rooftops, signifying a turning tide in the CCP's overseas influence.
For years, Chinatown has been the front line of the ideological and influence battles between Taiwan and Communist China. One way that battle manifests is in which flag local Chinese-American organizations choose to hang on their roofs. Communist China's red flag or Taiwan's blue sky, white sun flag. The latter was designed by Sun Yat-sen, referred to as the father of the nation. Sun's images and statues are still seen in Chinese communities across the U.S. A century ago, Sun's revolution overthrew the Qing dynasty and established China's first, yet short-lived democracy. That democracy was later inherited and revived in Taiwan after Sun's political party was defeated by the Chinese Communist Party, or CCP. His supporters then retreated to the island. The sky blue flag remains an eyesore for the CCP, which has spared no effort in its attempt to replace it. One example appears in local Chinese consulates and embassies. The regime often invites overseas Chinese community leaders back to China in an attempt to persuade them to change their flag.
The CCP would offer them food, drinks, prostitution, and other entertainment. When the community leaders come back to the U.S., the first thing they do is to take down the previous flag and replace it with a 5-star red flag. So through the years, there are more and more red flags in Chinatown.
Those who refused and continued to support Taiwan were often blacklisted by the Communist Party. Their visa applications to China were denied, they were blocked from visiting families in mainland China, and were even prohibited from doing business in China. But now, as the U.S. increases its scrutiny of the CCP's infiltration, the tide is starting to turn. Locals in San Francisco's Chinatown have noticed that some organizations are taking down the red flag, and a group of Chinese dissidents is now calling on more businesses and organizations to follow suit. One advocate says people should be free from fearing the CCP on American soil.
We should take down the CCP's flag. In this way, we can eliminate the fear in our hearts. We should return the sky of Chinatown back to a free sky.
The Chinese people have paid the highest price. Now the American people are also paying a huge price. The number of Americans who died from the virus is 50 times that of Pearl Harbor, 50 times that of 9/11. The CCP has killed so many people. Why do we still want to hang its blood-colored flag here? Isn't it a shame?
Scholars estimate a death toll of over 80 million since the CCP took power in China. That includes those killed in dozens of political campaigns and those who died as a result of the CCP's policies.
The 5-starred red flag is soaked with the blood of countless Chinese people. It's an evil flag.
The Trump administration's hardline approach towards CCP infiltration is making an impact in Chinese communities. A community leader inside New York City's Chinatown told media that pro-Beijing supporters have been extremely quiet recently, unlike before. He said they were often well paid by local Chinese consulates or embassies and used to actively carry out the CCP's agenda. That includes waving red flags, condemning Hong Kong's pro-democracy movement, or even physically attack pro-Taiwan activists during the Taiwanese president's visit last year. But this year, even as the U.S. closed the Chinese consulate in Houston, they did not go out to protest. Penny Zhou, NTD News.
A former CIA officer has been charged with selling U.S. secrets, including those about missiles, to the Chinese Communist regime. He was born in Hong Kong and says he wanted the motherland to succeed.
The alleged traitor, identified as Alexander Yukching Ma, operated in the East Asia and Pacific region. He's a 67-year-old naturalized U.S. citizen born in Hong Kong. Prosecutors said that 12 years after his retirement, Ma gave highly classified information to at least 5 officers of China's Ministry of State Security. The intel included the CIA's internal organization, methods for communicating covertly, and the identities of CIA officers and human assets. If convicted, he may face life in prison. Ma began working for the CIA in 1982, where he maintained top-secret clearance. 7 years later, he left the CIA and went to live and work in Shanghai. In 2001, he left Shanghai for Hawaii. Court documents say the same year, together with a relative, another former CIA officer, Ma began to hand over information to the Chinese Communist regime. The intel included details about the CIA's personnel, operations, and methods for concealing communications, as well as information related to guided missile and weapon systems. Part of their meeting with Chinese intelligence officers was captured on video. The clip shows Ma counting $50,000 in cash, paid in exchange for the secrets they provided. After Ma moved to Hawaii, he sought employment with the FBI, an effort to once again gain access to classified information. In 2004, the FBI's Honolulu field office hired him to review and translate Chinese language documents. Ma regularly took copied or stolen documents and images and other U.S. secrets with him on trips to China. Likewise, he often returned from China with thousands of dollars in cash and gifts, like new sets of golf clubs. After becoming aware of Ma's schemes, the FBI sent one of their employees to meet with Ma, posed as a representative for the Chinese regime. Ma admitted that he provided classified information to China's Ministry of State Security. According to investigators, Ma, who was born in Hong Kong, said he wanted the motherland to succeed. When asked about Ma's case on Tuesday, China's Foreign Ministry spokesman denied knowing about the case and accused the U.S. of slandering China.
As for other U.S. actions, the Trump administration is tightening restrictions on the Chinese telecoms giant Huawei. U.S. software and technology is now banned from being used as a basis for foreign-produced items, particularly those that will be used by Huawei. American technology providers are an essential part of developing, manufacturing, and installing chips into tech devices. Chip companies will struggle to survive if they can't work together with others. But now Huawei has to put together a patchwork of non-American suppliers who don't even use U.S. technology. The U.S. has already successfully lobbied many European countries to exclude Huawei from their 5G networks. The UK, France, and Slovenia have decided to completely block Huawei, while others will partially block it. Though Germany has yet to take a stance, the country stands as the largest economy in Europe and holds the current EU presidency. Huawei's European headquarters is also located there. As a result, Germany's attitude on the subject has become a focus for U.S. attention. Microsoft may have a new competitor in its bid to buy TikTok. The Financial Times reports that software giant Oracle is serious about buying TikTok in the U.S. and other countries.
The race for TikTok's US operations could have a new contender, Oracle. According to Britain's Financial Times newspaper, the tech company has held preliminary talks with the app's Chinese owner, ByteDance. Oracle is reportedly considering buying TikTok's operations in the US, Canada, Australia and New Zealand. Reuters reported earlier this month that Twitter had approached ByteDance to express its interest, while Microsoft was still the favourite to clinch the deal. The FT also said that Microsoft has considered a bid to take over TikTok operations beyond the nations it outlined earlier in August. Europe and India are reportedly of particular interest, even though the app was recently banned by the Indian government after border tensions with China. But ByteDance is opposed to the idea of selling any additional assets. Donald Trump last week ordered the firm to divest US operations of the video app within 90 days. He's cranking up the pressure on the Chinese company over concerns about the safety of the personal data it handles.
Southeast Asian countries are growing more concerned about China's influence. A new book talks about how the region is responding to the China challenge.
China's growing influence in Southeast Asia has caused mixed feelings among its smaller neighbors. Southeast Asia expert Murray Hebert recently published a book that explores how countries in the region have been impacted. It's called Under Beijing's Shadow: Southeast Asia's China Challenge. Murray says there's a lot of anxiety in Southeast Asian countries because of the rising US-China tensions, and that the region is concerned about a decoupling between the two nations.
Concern about whether this will result in a bifurcation of the global supply chain, of which many of the more developed economies in Southeast Asia are key parts of. And they're also worried about the bifurcation of technology.
When speaking about China's infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative in Southeast Asia, Murray says China is struggling.
It's really a struggle for China. Some countries are just holding them off at arm's length. Others keep negotiating for years. These projects have problems getting land. They have trouble getting local permits. There are a lot of struggles.
He says companies are considering moving businesses to Thailand, Malaysia, and Vietnam because of supply disruptions in China. Murray added that the U.S. recently established the International Development Finance Corporation to promote private investments as an alternative to Chinese state-funded investments. He says the U.S. program is slowly getting started, but that it's really important for Southeast Asian countries to get alternate funding instead of depending on China so much. On a recent book review, U.S. Senator Cory Gardner wrote, quote, "The next century will be defined by geopolitical competition in Asia and answering the China challenge." He says Southeast Asia is a region that will be critical to U.S. national and economic security. Phil Zhou, NTD News, New York.
China just started an anti-dumping probe into Australian wine imports. China claims that imported Australian wine is harming China's domestic wine industry by undercutting prices.
The market value of Australia's biggest winemaker, Treasury Wine Estates, took a 20% hit upon the announcement of China's anti-dumping probe. China is the top market for Australian wine exports and is also Australia's largest trading partner, with two-way trade worth $170 billion last year. Australia's trade minister says they stand by their winemakers and dismiss China's allegations.
We find these suggestions deeply troubling and quite perplexing. Australian wine is by no means subsidised. It is by no means sold at or below anything other than market rates in the world market.
The investigation by China's Commerce Ministry examines damage to the domestic wine industry from 2015 to 2019. They say domestic wine production has significantly reduced as a result of an influx of Australian wine. The China Alcoholic Drinks Association said Australian wine producers are reducing prices to increase market share. South Australian Wine Group's MD, David Harris, said the export data doesn't support any facts that they are dumping wine. He also said their wine is more expensive than virtually any wine exporting country in the world. The Chinese government recently placed import tariffs on barley from Australia and also warned Chinese not to travel to Australia because of accusations of racism. Counterfeits of Australian premium wines like Penfolds are commonly found in China.
And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.